I have a confession to make. I'm not a huge fan of the deadlift for combat sports. I haven't used the deadlift in over a decade within my own training, and I have no plans on bringing it back. And I'm going to show you why you may want to drop the deadlift altogether within your training. The first one is lower back pain. Now, not everyone suffers from lower back pain when deadlifting. A lot of people will say if you deadlift properly, you won't have this pain. But I've worked with high-level athletes, hundreds of them throughout my career, and I can count on one hand the amount of times that I've programmed the conventional deadlift. And it's for this reason. Athletes get beat up during their sport, especially during combat sports where you're having to get into funky positions, especially within grappling and MMA, and then even in striking sports where you're in these bent over postures. The lower back can take a beating. You're now adding a heavier stress on top of that. Now, I'm not saying not to train and strengthen your lower back, but I believe there are better ways of doing it that don't involve the deadlift. The second reason is the greater risk of injury. Now, the deadlift is a heavy lift. If you're going to get injured doing something within the gym, often it comes down to this exercise. A lot of people find they hurt their lower backs, they hurt their upper backs, whatever it is performing the deadlift. Now, again, just because your form is good doesn't mean that one day you won't come out with something wrong from a deadlifting session. Now, we could say that about many different exercises, but in my experience, the risk is much greater when you are using the deadlift. Now, especially if you get one small thing wrong within it, it can cost you limping around, having lower back pain when you're trying to perform your technical training. The risk versus reward just isn't there in my experience. We then have the problem of fatigue. When we're talking strength training or strength and conditioning for combat sports, we're talking about training that is complementary to your technical training. That means whatever you're doing within the gym needs to allow you to perform your technical training to a high level without too much fatigue. Obviously, there are times within the year where you may perform more volume or more intensity within the gym that may negatively impact your technical training, which is fine. But more often than not, you're looking to perform your strength training so it complements what you're doing within the gym. Now, deadlifting is one of the hardest things to recover from, especially if you were going heavy. That is why you'll see high-level strongmen and powerlifters will perform their very heavy deadlifts 2 to 4 weeks out from their competitions. Because it is so fatiguing, that is what you need to do. Now, obviously you're not lifting the same numbers as a lot of these strength athletes, but the premise still stands. If you are deadlifting heavy, it's much harder to recover from than other lower body or full body exercises. The fourth reason is when you're planning your strength training for combat sports, you're typically only performing 2 to 3 days a week of actual training within the gym. That often means you're either performing 1 lower body and 1 upper body day, or you're performing 2 full body days. And within these days, you need to pick a heavy lower body movement. And that means you're typically choosing between a squat and a deadlift. Now, in my experience and in my opinion, the squat is a better choice than the deadlift. And you cannot use both, or you can use both, but it can be difficult to balance that stress and fatigue if you are using both exercises. Hence why I recommend choosing the squat and then using a deadlift variation instead of the conventional deadlift. Now, you can get away with doing both. Some grapplers like to perform squats on one day, deadlifts on the other, and that is fine. It's a sport that is more strength-based, and if you program it properly, it can be okay. However, I much prefer to perform, for example, a front squat or a back squat or a squat variation on one day, and the second day should be a deadlift variation that's not gonna elicit the same fatigue or target very similar adaptations that we're gonna get from the squat. We can also add that the deadlift doesn't have any centric portion to it like the squat does. Obviously, the eccentric or the lowering phase of the exercise gives us adaptations that the concentric only exercise does not. And that is why I much prefer doing the squat and then using a deadlift variation. On the topic of deadlift variations, I believe you get much more out of other deadlift variations versus the conventional deadlift. And I mean variations like the Romanian deadlift in particular, because you get pure hip extension. You're getting the stretch on the hamstrings and you're getting that bent over position, whereas the deadlift is more of a push exercise. I wouldn't say exactly like a squat, but very similar. So I prefer to have a pure hip hinge like the Romanian deadlift paired with a squat versus having the squat paired with a deadlift. Now, there are other deadlift variations as well you can perform, and I will cover those later in the video. But if you're liking this so far, please make sure to like and subscribe, as we give you more tips. The final reason why I'm not a huge fan of the deadlift is if you're performing other deadlift variations or Olympic weightlifting derivatives, for example, clean pulls, snatch pulls, power cleans, hang clean, high pulls, all these different variations, then performing the deadlift is kind of redundant at that point because you're already getting a pulling exercise in. If you're doing power cleans and then doing deadlifts after, you're just setting yourself up to be so fatigued going to technical training. It just doesn't make sense. So if you're performing some of these exercises, it doesn't make sense to use the deadlift. Now, if you're not doing any of these other exercises, okay, we can make a case for you using the deadlift in this situation. However, I feel you get more out of doing some of these Olympic weightlifting derivatives, especially as a grappler or MMA athlete, compared to using the conventional deadlift. Okay, but you've listened to all of this, you don't agree with me, you like to deadlift. How can you use the deadlift within your training so it doesn't have these negative impacts leading to your technical training? The first thing I advise to do is to use a trap bar, specifically the high handles on the trap bar. There's a couple of reasons for this. One, because the trap bar, you are centered inside it with your hands by your side, you reduce the stress on your lower back. It turns more into a squat pattern versus a hip hinge pattern, which is why if you're doing the trap bar deadlift, I would recommend swapping that for the squat and then using single leg variations. Now I'll cover that in just a second. But the second reason is to use the high handles. It shortens the range of motion. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to express or generate the most amount of force as possible directly into the ground. Obviously that has a great impact into our striking power and even penetrating shots within grappling. So we want to be able to do that with a trap bar with high handles. We reduce the risk of injury, we reduce the fatigue, and we can still develop strength. The second option, if you don't have a trap bar available, is to use your regular conventional deadlift, but perform them speed style. And by speed style, I mean you're using a much reduced intensity, 50, 60, even up to 70% of your 1RM, but you're trying to move the bar quickly. You're performing maybe 2 to 3 reps in a set. You can even add bands for accommodating resistance to do this. And that way you are significantly reducing the load, reducing fatigue, but you're still accelerating the bar. Now you may still need a maximum strength stimulus, which you may get from a squat, but at least this way you're not getting that residual fatigue through the lower back. The last thing to consider when you're programming the conventional deadlift is what you do with your squat pattern. So I like to think about it like this. If you're using the conventional deadlift as your main lower body movement, you should use single leg squat variations for your squatting movement. So for example, you might do a conventional deadlift 3 sets of 3, whatever that is. After that, or on a separate day, you might do something like a Bulgarian split squat as your main lower body single leg push movement. And then vice versa, when we're doing squat as our main movement, whatever squat that is, then the secondary movement should be something that is a deadlift variation. It could be some kind of Olympic weightlifting derivative. It could be a Romanian deadlift. It could be a single leg Romanian deadlift. These are options that pair well because you have one hard, high intensity stimulus in that week, and then everything else supports that, versus trying to jam heavy squats plus heavy deadlifts within a week. That can potentially cause issues. Now, if you're doing this already, you feel good, hey, I'm not stopping you, keep doing what you're doing. But for the majority of combat athletes, this tends to work best. And even within athletes that train a lot, this works very, very well. And I've done this for many years with many athletes, and it works really well doing it like this versus trying to jam both exercises into a training week. So I want to know down in the comments, are you using the conventional deadlift? Have you given up the deadlift to perform other lifts based on the experiences that I have mentioned within this video? Or are you a deadlift diehard and you're still going with the deadlift within your combat training? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I might create more videos on this if you have more questions.